So let's talk about absolute value. In general, absolute value is having these bars around a number or an expression or an x. And if you've done absolute value before, it's probably been to just kind of be like, okay, absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of -5 is also 5. And then maybe something more complicated so that you're doing order of operations. And we're going to expand on that idea because we're in algebra and we use x's. So first off, this picture I have that has absolute value bars around x, we would read this as the absolute value of x. Okay, that's just how we would say it. So the absolute value of x, or whatever's inside, that's how we would read it. So then what's our definition? And then separately, I also have, what does that mean? So the technical definition of absolute value is that it's the distance of a number or variable from 0. So it's how far away is what's inside from 0. And so if we're looking at our absolute value of 5, well, it's asking us how far away is positive 5 from 0? The answer to that is, well, it's 5 away. Whenever it asks us the absolute value of -5, it's saying how many spaces away from 0 is -5. And because it's a distance, our answer can't be negative. We don't have negative distances. So that's why it basically takes away the negative if there is one. So that's the what does that mean? What does that mean? That we make whatever is inside positive. Okay, so there's a technically, here's what we're doing, and then there's a practically, this is what you need to remember, that it just changes whatever's inside and makes it positive. Now, there are certain ways that we need to do that because of order of operations. So my next thing here is, where does this belong in PEMDAS? Which is, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, and is the way that we remember order of operations. And so this would be a case of there not being any x's. If there's no x's involved and it's just expressions, then absolute value is a grouping symbol. Just like parentheses. The difference is that with parentheses, once we've figured out what's inside, we can typically drop those parentheses, and that's all we do, we just drop them. But with absolute value, we're not going to just drop those bars. We're going to say, okay, I'm going to take whatever's inside and make it positive if I need to. So that's the order. If there aren't any x's involved, that's the order that you would go about it. That if you have absolute values, it is equal to having parentheses. So it's going to be something you do first. But if there are x's, and this has actually to do with the fact that just in general with equations, order of operations kind of works backwards. So when there are x's, we're going to wait to deal with the absolute value until it's by itself on one side of the equation. Okay, so how do I solve an absolute value equation? We are going to look in detail about what it means on the next video, but just kind of here are the steps to look back at. I solve an absolute value equation by, first off, solving for the absolute value whenever I do steps like this, I'm always like, this is going to make more sense after we've already talked about how to do it. So it might be that you just look back at this and go, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. So the first step is solve for the absolute value. I don't know why I said solving. I would rather say solve. Perfect. Okay. Then next we write two equations. One with a positive and one with a negative. So we're going to basically say, okay, I'm going to split this into two equations. One where I'm trying to figure out what would make this positive, one where I try to figure out what would make it negative, because absolute valuing whatever the negative version of it is going to end up giving us the same thing. So that also means that we most of the time are going to get two answers for this, kind of like how quadratic equations gave us two answers. And so then our last step is just to solve both equations. And we're also going to do inequalities, and the steps would be very similar. Just anytime that something is different about inequalities, we might have to do something different. Absolute value is an interesting function because most functions that we have in math, we have an opposite thing we can do. So like how we learned that, x squared equals 16. If I want to get rid of this squared, I can square root, because those are opposite things, squaring and square root. But there's not something like that for absolute value. Instead, we have to use our knowledge and say, okay, that means that I need to split this up into two things. One's the positive and one is negative. And that's a little bit frustrating in my opinion, but it's whatever. So finally, what is a real world situation where having absolute value would be helpful? And so anytime you try to do real world application in math, it can seem kind of lame and okay, why would I actually do that? Because the people who are actually doing absolute values are probably doing some much higher level of math. But it would be the idea of I have something, but it might be actually more or less than what I have by a certain amount. So an example of that would be if you're like, okay, I think the weatherman says the temperature today is going to be 78 degrees. Okay, but we, from experience or whatever, know that the weatherman is usually within 2 degrees of what he predicts. So that means that it could be 78 plus 2, so that's 80, or it could be 78 minus 2, which is 76. And I didn't write this with absolute value, but I could. I could say, okay, my two temperatures are going to result from me having x minus 78 inside absolute values equals 2. So the 78 is what our prediction was, and then we're saying the difference between our prediction and what's actually happening, which would be x, that difference is 2, but because it's distance, it could be 2 above or 2 below. So that's where absolute value comes in. And so anything that has any sort of error or, wiggle room, I could be I want to spend an hour doing this, but I'd be okay with it being a little over or a little under an hour. That's the idea of having some wiggle room and not having to have an exact thing. If you think about it, a lot of times in life, we do have wiggle room, right? I'm not saying you're going to write an equation, an absolute value equation, anytime that happens, but you could, and there are people who do that as a part of their jobs and professions. So, thanks for watching.